Love to have Kyle go next. And I know he's already introduced himself, so kind of just buying time while he gets his PowerPoint up on the screen here. But thanks so much, Dan, and definitely tons of time to talk during the Q&A in a little bit as well.
Good, and I think that's visible to everybody. And thanks, Dan. I'm going to touch on a few topics that Dan did just to kind of reinforce some of those things, but I'm also going to kind of go on my own little tangent. And I didn't actually get a chance to see all the attendees in the room, so I don't know if I have any official bosses in the room, but something I want to start with that I always dream of quitting my job and going to raise alpacas and getting involved in farming. And I kind of made a joke earlier that, again, this was my threat often to my parents that I'm not going to go to school to become a doctor. That was my initial trajectory. I wanted, I'd always threatened to quit and just start living off the land to, grow blueberries, raise up some alpacas. I have a fascination with alpacas and, leave the ivory tower. So, I still have that drive. And, one of those components or one of those things that, I don't necessarily think we always think about is that, where I come from, where our peoples, the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga, where we're originally from, is this land of fantastic agricultural capacity. Right? If you look at Southern Ontario and even going to where we are right now, or where we are currently our tribe in Northern Ontario, there's a little bit of, there's quite a bit of capacity to actually be able to grow really good agriculture. But again, we all know how colonialism goes and all that good, valuable land. Most of the communities that were historically on these areas, eventually got, pushed away, right? We all got displaced. So this is where I'm from in Northern Ontario. And here's my home community. Again, really fascinating place, really, super productive, right? We have these bird's foot deltas that are relatively unique and not very common across North America that accumulates all sorts of sediment, and it's, just a really productive system. Fortunately, near this bird's foot delta of the Mississauga River, kind of our namesake river, just beyond those trees, you can see a nuclear upgrading facility. Right, so this is the, again, one of the most significant places for our community, for our nation, for our culture, for who we are as people. And nearby, there's a nuclear facility. And I kind of just want to highlight a little bit of this geography. And again, here you can see, Mississauga First Nation here, my community, to the right. To the left of it, we see quite a bit of agricultural development. Right? We see all sorts of farms. There's some pasture. There's a little bit of oat and wheat over here. A few people grow corn, but not in any great quantity. But then as soon as you start going a little east, you start to see there's no more farms, right? All that good land stops. And yeah, you could overlay some soil maps. Okay, maybe some of the soil is not super capable. But I was trying to spend the time, but I didn't manage to do it. But the one driving factor for the ending of farms is those are the boundaries of our First Nation. So the boundaries of our First Nation fit perfectly at the perimeter, at the edge of all these settler communities. So again, this is, the environment that I was raised in, right? That all this farm, all this agriculture was just on the other side of the fence, just on the other side of the boundary. There's very little agricultural development or projects or any initiatives within our community, despite even being in Northern Ontario, a really good local agricultural scene for that matter. And I think it's important to think about some of these elements. This is about an hour and a half down the road from where I grew up, near Garden River. Dan mentioned Sault Ste. Marie. The Trans-Canada Highway used to pass this train bridge, right? This train bridge that indicated this is Indian land. So even if you're coming over from Michigan, from the States, and you want to spend time in Northern Ontario, camping, cottaging, fishing, you historically always pass this. And again, this is something we don't necessarily think about when we're looking at how do we build, more capacity, more space for Indigenous scientists, or how do we train up that next generation of farmers that are potentially more diverse, that might have a lot more Indigenous students coming into them. are coming into our field and to our sector. And again, I think this is something that we have to keep in mind, that Canada, the success of Canada has been fueled by the displacement of Indigenous people off their land to produce agriculture, right? One of our primary industries that drives export markets, that drive a lot of our economic engine here in Canada, United States, and globally, right? That is the one thing that, really made Canada special. They had all this access to free and available natural resources, right? Because again, not considering Indigenous ownership. Beyond all that, even if you've survived, all the diseases, all the colonization, all the displacement, even if you survived all that in Canada and the United States, well, okay, great. A couple generations survived all that hell. Now we have residential school and we have agriculture, or this agricultural education, or the guise of agricultural education, being a, covering up for what is oftentimes forced labor, just to keep a lot of these residential schools going, whether in Red Deer or at the Brandon Residential School, right? There's all sorts of students, their relationship, the knowledge and how agriculture was shared amongst communities, if they made it, if they survived residential school, going back to their community, what they'd share about agriculture was likely not very positive. And even if you survived residential school and you learned a little bit about farming and you were able to maintain a little bit of a historic connection to traditional land management practices that allowed you to cultivate and harvest natural resources from the land, you weren't necessarily able to actually access those markets that can give value to those products, right? We had Indian agents that served as that intermediary between Indigenous peoples and the settler colonies or other people trying to potentially buy your produce or your livestock or any of your products. And again, right, this is an image that's taken from the Library of Congress in Washington. People at the time were even joking, right? There's these, I don't know if this is from the New Yorker or what, but again, this was a meme, right? One of those early 1900 memes. People knew what Indian agents were doing, right? They were diminishing the access to markets by Indigenous people and making a profit while doing that. So again, my talk is supposed to be about Indigenous leadership in agriculture, but how the heck do we get there, right? This is just how the OECD characterizes the land or the situation of Indigenous lands here in Canada and North America. Right, we have very little land, right? Indigenous people have very little access or administration capacity over, less than 1% of land. And even of that less than 1% land, again, it's dictated through all sorts of Indian acts and government legislation of how we can actually utilize that. Again, we were displaced off that high quality land, so very low natural resources potentially in a lot of areas, very low agricultural capacity. And again, like my community, Mississauga, we're often nearby, right next to a lot of industrial development or any or other industrial processes that make it hard to actually have a healthy environment or conduct agriculture in a healthy way. So again, we don't think of that Indigenous presence or those challenges by Indigenous people. And what this shows, all this map is just communities of Anishinaabe speakers across the Midwest, essentially. Right, so despite losing all our land, despite having such a small land base, these are kind of proximity heat circles of where the language is the strongest, right? So you can see a lot of areas where we have a lot of people still utilizing Anishinaabe our language. Again, indicative, you could potentially use that as a proxy to think about are areas where we have that strongest cultural resiliency, where a lot of our values, a lot of our belief systems, and potentially a lot of our practices are still within how things are governed, or how people share stories, or how people think about the landscape. When we think about agriculture or potential Indigenous contributions to agriculture, right, we tend to think of some of those key elements, those really interesting wild plants that eventually got domesticated over thousands of years, and again fueled a revolution in how not only Europe ate, but how the entire planet ate and how they cooked and how they actually developed their own culture from these indigenous derived technologies, right? All these crop varieties represent years and years and generations of selection, of understanding agricultural landscapes, of understanding the underlying ecological functions that, again, fuel some of these things like, carbon sequestration, pollination, genetic diversity, and understanding the ecological network around these plants to be able to evolve them into what they are today, or even were back then. And right now, I think we're having a really fascinating change in how we start to view any industry. Bird and Nemo wrote a paper a few years ago about how to think about the reintegration of humans into our ecological systems, right? Where all those processes, all our acts, all the things that we prioritize and do on the landscape, again, are going to affect that greater ecological network, all those species, all those systems around us. And that's fine, right? Thinking of it ecologically. But if we look at where we're going as a farming industry, as a sector, we're seeing that, oh my God, we're actually integrating a lot of traditional practices, historical practices, not only those by Indigenous people, but even of classical or historic European or old world agriculture, right? We have an example here with no-till farming, right? We're trying to improve soil quality and carbon content and these elements. Integrated pest management, right? We're minimizing inputs. We're trying to reestablish pest predator dynamics to kind of minimize our use of having to, or our need to put in inputs. Integrated fertility management. We're thinking of not only growing our crops, growing our biomass, but growing fertility within those soils that we've been taking from for a century or more. And even going beyond that, right? We're building that local knowledge. We're allowing farmers, local farmers, groups of farmers to actually have a say and have some ability, some self-determination in deciding what is that future of our oat? What is that future of our wheat? What is that future of our canola crop going to look like through programs like participatory breeding programs, where we're engaging those local knowledge holders, farmers, to, again, build our agricultural system in a way that actually works for them. So we're doing all this, and I think that's something we tend to forget. And I used to trap a lot with my family growing up. And at the end of the trapping season, right, we'd always burn. We'd burn, we wouldn't even put our fires up, right? That always went against what Smokey Bear told us on TV, not to leave these fires go. And I never really thought much of it until getting into this academic position and thinking about all these practices, right? And we have quite a bit of knowledge and information about that use of fire to create corridors, not necessarily to facilitate trapping, but to kind of reconfigure some of these areas where trappers were trapping in years before, right? Creating corridors that might benefit predators, that might benefit prey, that might benefit fur-bearing species. You're developing mosaics, you're creating landscape, not necessarily for your own practice, but for what you see as being integral to the functioning of that ecosystem. And even when I was doing my master's thesis, I was telling my parents, oh my God, I found all sorts of really interesting trends in how we have to manage low bush blueberry, right? We have to manage the size of these clones. I told my dad, and he said, duh. So what do you mean, duh? So, well, yeah, your grandpa and your grandma used to go out and burn forest in particular lines and in particular patterns, again, to maximize heterogeneity, to maximize the diversity of age structure for birch, for different craft needs and all these elements. So, even unbeknownst to me, I was rediscovering things that my grandparents did just because I, again, didn't ask, or I wasn't creating that connection between what we were doing to enhance agricultural productivity with what was being done on the ground in the landscape. And again, thinking of it a little bit more broadly, we know there's all sorts of different reasons why communities or different nations and cultures are going to burns. Sometimes it might just be for harvesting more resources, but again, a lot of times it is to kind of build that ecological capacity or expand ecological ranges. This is an example I always like to talk about, being a pollination biologist. And basically all this outlines is the historic area where we would find this particular cucurbit here in yellow. And then also the range of, so the range of this particular bee used to align very tightly with that historical range in yellow on the map. Right? This is a specialist bee that only pollinates cucurbits. But as we started trading and expanding agricultural networks in Indigenous communities, like Dan was describing, we started to spread the range of this host plant. And now what we see, if we're to sample for Peponapsis pruinosa, we're going to see this insect across the continent. Right? So Indigenous people themselves were building diversity, expanding the range, expanding potentially the resiliency of this insect to evolve and utilize resources, or providing those resources. And we have all sorts of global challenges right now. Again, I'm focusing on bees or the loss of diversity associated with agricultural intensification. And we don't actually have very good solutions to solve these things, right? We don't really have those ways to kind of value the conservation value of a farm system necessarily. And I think this is where we can start building that Indigenous leadership. Again, these are on the left, I stole a figure from the Southern First Nations Network of Care that outline the 7 grandfather teachings. So these are kind of the underlying fundamental principles upon which my nation, my culture is based upon. My knowledge generation system is focused on amplifying and enhancing all these elements in things we do. And again, on the right, this is just a diagram of showing that projected loss of some of our rarest, most productive, coolest, most fun ecosystems, right? The different biomes. And we're seeing increasingly going forward, no matter how much we're going to protect the world or try to stop some of the loss of biodiversity, we're still going to eat into a pretty large chunk of a lot of these habitats. But if we're kind of prioritizing a different set of values or principles, how might we mitigate this, or how might we actually change this loss? Maybe it's not a complete loss. Maybe we're still providing some sort of functioning. Similarly, we know that climate change and global greenhouse gas emissions are going to continue going up for the next 20, 30 years, despite everything that global leaders are trying to plan. How can we actually start to modify this? If we start utilizing principles such as, being truthful of what our industries are actually doing and how we can actually change these things, maybe we can start modifying our practices, modifying that value chain in agriculture to make sure that farmers are getting, value for being really good carbon sequestrators or being good biodiversity refugia. And similarly, this is, again, my grand idea. I'm all, maybe I don't want to come across as overly communist, but we know we have this great gap in wealth globally. And we know one of the key indicators of global wealth is controlling land base, right? Controlling resources. So potentially bringing in Indigenous knowledge systems, values, and principles provides us with a framework on how we can actually make decisions and start to modify our entire society to, again, characterize an indicator as lowering that gap in wealth, right? That should be an indicator rather than just something like GDP. So, and how do we get there? Well, heck if I know. I'm struggling in this class. I teach a bunch of Aggie students. I'm trying to identify all these issues. I'm not providing them with a lot of solutions, but I'm allowing them to start to craft their own solutions. All these students are more expert in their particular fields than me, and they see the future in a more youthful way, maybe a more optimistic way than I do. So they're providing it and they're developing these things. And even my work with Emily and Dan in the Federal Public Service, right? We're trying to train up our research scientists to actually be able to start to think about how to create space for those Indigenous leaders in our agricultural industry or in our science industry across Canada. And again, we have all sorts of interesting projects. Melissa and Anthony are going to talk to us about a really cool project. And again, this is I think, a South American example of building lab systems. But again, how we approach research is really important, and making sure that we're not just focused kind of on that conventional data collection, interpretation, and then kind of making sure that we have knowledge translation to get more Indigenous farmers doing that same old thing. We have to start building in that self-determination of what science actually looks like, and allow science to actually drive hope in community leaders to allow them to actually start to figure out what is my indicator of success going to be for my agricultural industry locally. I'm going to skip the image on the left just for time, but I'm going to take a minute on this image in the right. So this is in my community, Mississauga First Nation. 20 years ago, I had cleared all this and I made a basketball court next door to it too. You can see it in this image. But when I went to my community this summer, I was a little pissed. You're gonna say, oh my God, they're putting a dome, they have these boxes. Oh, that's not an efficient use of that limited ag horticultural space. Right? So I bet you we could have made a plan to really maximize the use of all these resources. But then, listening to people and talking to everybody, so, the goal, the biggest success this can have is not just providing food to people. It's not just being able to grow a few greens in the wintertime. The production value, that's important, but it wasn't really important. What this is actually doing is creating hope, right? It is creating access. Indigenous students are learning about agriculture for the first time, right? This little area, these domes, these garden beds, are building responsibility, building connection with landscape, with agriculture, with plants, more so than actually producing a really good agricultural crop. And I think even in my own research projects, right, this is where I'm realizing that, oh my God, every time I failed at a research project, it's because I wasn't really thinking in a holistic way. Right, so, oh my God, I love bees. I want to know more about the bee biodiversity in northern Manitoba, right? We have very few records of bees up in the north, right? As you can see on the right relative to the left. So I crafted all this, justification. So we need bees and happy flowers and good landscapes to, really produce a lot of wild harvested food to make happy Indigenous people. That's great and all, but again, it wasn't actually confronting or actually tackling any of those major issues that a lot of these northern communities are having. And similarly, even in kind of just my conventional research work, where I have students working on something like hydro power lines. Yes, we're characterizing the biodiversity of these regions, but again, even our lab is falling short of actually being able to reintegrate Indigenous values in the management of these power lines. Yes, we manage these power lines to keep them nice and clear and free of debris, but we haven't actually thought about utilizing this land under these power lines as a way to actually reintegrate Indigenous harvesting methods to prioritize biodiversity that's relevant locally. And and I keep on repeating all these mistakes. Even in my Three Sisters project, I said, let's look at the biodiversity associated with Three Sisters. Great, yes, that's going to result in some cool papers. But as we start to work with more communities, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't just look at beneficial insects. Let's look at culturally relevant biodiversity, right? We have the community wanting us to bring all the crop residue or bring our leftover pumpkins there to feed the deer, right? To attract deer, to really create an alternative food source for them in the fall and the winter, right? And yes, we're going to look at pollination, but how do we look at a Three Sisters and start to evaluate it for other ecological services, especially those that are associated with increasing cultural value or just that beauty of the landscape, right? Thinking about things beyond yield and kind of going towards how does the implementation of some Three Sisters research sites actually start to build those links between community and these plants. Right here we have Jason, right? You'd never talk to Jason and imagine that this is in real time, him reconnecting with the land, not having access to the land or any opportunity to learn about the land growing up, but now being part of these projects is giving him that opportunity to really start thinking about what does it mean to me to be a human that influences the landscape. And I kind of wanted just to touch on a few kind of more topical terms. it's our responsibility, all of our responsibility to do this, right? And every moment we don't think about these things, or we say, oh, that's too much for me, I can't get involved. We're supporting the system in place, right? We're supporting what's happening right now. And what's happening right now, again, is a legacy of colonialism, right? So we all have to actually do an action. You have to do something to be anti-racist. You can't just say, I'm not racist. Similarly, you can't just say, I'm not colonial. No, we have to actually all group together and begin to deconstruct a lot of these systems. And I'll kind of finish. We know it's Women's Week, right? It's International Women's Day, and these things are really important to make sure that we're creating that link from elders to youth, making sure that everybody's involved in these projects. And things like science camps, cultural camps, where we're bringing people on the land is really important. And I highlight this in my lectures, I highlight this in various talks. We know for a lot of, I know the developing world is not the right word, but we know in a lot of these areas that are not as well off as Canada, the solution oftentimes is to empower and educate women, right? That is one of the greatest acts we can do to reduce poverty and to really engage and diversify whatever sector we're in. So I think it's really important to highlight these things because, again, colonialism has driven out the value of women in all sorts of agricultural industry or agricultural cultures, both Indigenous and non-Indigenous. They always played a really important role globally. So I think I kind of just wanted to end there and think about these systems are complex. When we're talking about agriculture, we're not just talking about agriculture. It requires us to indigenize everything from that policy making stage all the way to that creation of food security and food availability. So miigwech, thank you, everybody.
Miigwech, thank you so much, Kyle. That was phenomenal. Always a great message, and like, I don't know, so many multiple great messages in there.